how have you found in trying to facilitate decentralized communities and organizations, how have you found ways of getting around the sort of classic leadership problem? Because humans do have this sort of tribal wiring in us where we do want to tend to coalesce around leadership. And so without leadership, you run into all kinds of coordination problems. How have you found ways of solving those problems?
Both, you know, there's problems with leadership as well, right? There's the reason that I bought into the Occupy Leaderless story was it made sense to me that if you had an identifiable leader of a potent movement that was really about disrupting power and interrupting capitalism and doing something a lot more equitable, it would just seem so obvious to me that those leaders would come under such an extreme attack that it kind, that's kind of like the problem on the other side of the fence, right? Like, whenever there's a challenge of coordinating a group of people, there's going to be so many paradoxes and difficulties in it. And maybe what we were doing with Occupy was, testing the limits of what happens when you try to work without a designated figure who has this like special role, who's the boss or the founder or the manager or the whatever. And at the time, I think definitely for myself and probably for a bunch of the other people involved, I had a very naive attitude about it, that it was my first kind of contact of, observing hierarchy as an object, instead of being inside of it and being subject to it, but actually, I'd never been in an organization that was non-hierarchical before, so I'd never noticed there was a thing called hierarchy. And the naivety of it was, we're going to call ourselves leaderless, therefore there's no leaders.
Right.
There's no one has a designated role. There's no organizational chart which you can point to and say, well, clearly this person's in charge. And somehow we thought that by removing that explicit layer, that was going to somehow equalize power. And we learned the hard way, of course, that power is a lot more nuanced and sticky and sometimes kind of, subtle and hidden than the particular role that we put on an organizational chart. And so subsequent to that, and my work with, it's been now a decade that I've been working basically entirely with organizations that are non-hierarchical or less hierarchical. We've learned a lot, and a lot of it comes down to refining, complexifying, and adding nuance to our ideas about organizations. So the naive version was, you can either be vertical or horizontal. You can be hierarchical or non-hierarchical. And now the more complexified is like, you hear me talk about decentralization, meaning not that there is no center, but that the center is being pushed outwards. That there are multiple points of influence and nodes of connection, and they're moving. And we're intentionally going to the edges and trying to draw them inwards, and we're looking where the concentrations of power are and trying to push it outwards. But it's complex, it's a mess, it's a network, it's not a triangle. You'll also hear me talk about coercion and domination, and those are the things I think that for my particular brand of anarchism, whatever credentials I've got left as an anarchist these days, which is not very much, but whatever anarchism I've got, it's about domination. It's about looking for ways of relating to each other without domination. And now, as I've matured in my understanding, that doesn't mean leaderless. It's like I've been in groups where there is someone that has a designated leadership role, and I don't feel that I'm being dominated by following their lead. And to be able to decouple those things has been really helpful for me to understand. There's all different flavors of power, and some of them are unhealthy and some of them are actually fine, So like one of the examples I give is in the context of hospitality. If you're a guest in my house, there's a power dynamic there, It's really, it's actually completely natural in every culture that I've ever encountered that the host has a kind of power over the guest, but it's not over the guest. It's in support of the guest. It's an attitude of service and consideration and taking care of and giving care to the guest. And the guest is there's a kind of mutual obligation that's happening there. And that's an example of a kind of power relationship that many people have encountered and been delighted by, and not seen it as a problem or a concern. And so there are, I found it really helpful to kind of notice these kind of examples of when power difference can be healthy and generative and fun and enjoyable. And then say, well, can we do that in organizations too? Can we have the concept of a host and a guest in an organization? Or maybe it's clearer to say, like an initiator or a founder or someone who is holding a certain part of the enterprise here, and that they're taking that hospitality attitude to their role rather than the domineering attitude. And can we, as a group, have conversations about the way that power is being exercised here and the difference between healthy and toxic power and that sort of stuff? Then it just requires a lot more unpacking and getting into the detail with each other and making the implicit explicit, drawing it up into the above the surface, and being able to talk about our experiences. When have you felt like the power dynamics have been healthy, and when have you felt like they weren't healthy? Well, that's a very vulnerable conversation to have. So you need to invest in creating really high trust relationships where people feel they can actually be honest with each other and they're not going to be punished. They're not going to face some kind of sanctions for saying, well, actually, I think Rich is really taking up too much space here, and he's his ego is running out of check, and we need to rebalance. Like, that's a hard thing for someone to say, to challenge someone who's holding a lot of power and influence. But it's absolutely essential that those kind of conversations can happen if you're going to approach a more equal, a more healthy way.